Hello and welcome to another edition of Consider This from the beautiful campus of IUPUI here in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Sam Graves. Thanks for joining us. The thing we're going to be talking about today, the subject matter, basically has to do with an essential question of international relations, and that is, when should a nation like the United States, for example, a superpower, actively intervene militarily or otherwise in another nation's internal affairs if the object is to prevent violence or stop violence, stop bloodshed, whatever it's called. Humanitarian intervention, it's called responsibility to protect. And with us today to discuss that very thing is Dr. John Clark. He's the head of a think tank here in Indianapolis called Provocate, a frequent guest here on IUPUI on matters of international polemics and politics. And our special guest is Dr. Brett O'Bannon, who is an associate professor of political science and the coordinator of the conflict studies program at DePauw. Brett, welcome for the first time to the show. We promise to go easy on you.
Good.
On the subject matter. But the question I posited kind of is, when should a nation become involved? And I know that the United Nations has been involved in the creation of something known in the business, I guess, as R2P, or the responsibility to protect, which I infer from that the nations with the means to do so have a responsibility of some kind to intervene when people are dying, when children are starving, when there's great warfare going on, like 100,000 dead so far in Syria. How does one define the responsibility to protect, to decide, to make the decision to move in? And I know the United Nations is involved. Why don't you just kind of give us a Cook's tour of how that works?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, the proponents of the responsibility to protect are pretty adamant in trying to drive a wedge, a conceptual wedge, between the concept of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. They really seek to kind of break the synonymity of those two things. The humanitarian intervention problematique really came to a fore in the early post-Cold War period. A lot changed with the demise of the Soviet Union with respect to this question of intervention. There was no longer this deadlocked Security Council at the UN. As a result, there was an explosion of international peacekeeping operations across the world. We were intervening in conflicts that we would never have intervened in during the Cold War. The sovereignty principle that had prevailed throughout the Cold War and is said to be responsible for the very few interventions that took place during the Cold War was sort of giving way to new thinking, new humanitarian thinking, you know, but the 90s were a really confused time. We started the decade with this terrible civil war in Liberia, the Somalia Intervention, the Srebrenica and Rwanda genocides. We closed the decade with the Kosovo Intervention and an intervention in East Timor to stop the slaughter there. The reason I say it was confused is we didn't intervene in Rwanda. We let Srebrenica happen, but just a few years before that, we had decided that famine in Somalia was worth an intervention. Then, subsequent to the failure to intervene in Rwanda, we decided to go back into the intervention scheme and to intervene in Kosovo, but without Security Council authorization, which is really important, and we should talk about that problem. So it was a really confused time, and at the end of that decade, there was seemingly a real clamoring, a real search for some new certainty in international affairs with respect to sovereignty and intervention, and particularly for human rights purposes, human protection problems. And in 2000, an important commission, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, convened and issued a report called The Responsibility to Protect. And it's been said...
when was it, 2000?
In 2000.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
And it has been said that no idea has moved as fast and as far in the international normative arena as the responsibility to protect idea since at least the Genocide Convention. It was written into international law just 5 years later at the World Summit. The basic proposition of the responsibility to protect, or propositions, are quite simple. The first one is that states themselves have a responsibility to protect their own people, their citizens. So the first responsibility lies with the state. So the reason I mention that is there's a concern among some opponents of intervention that these are sovereignty violations. So it's clear from the proponents, the architects of the responsibility to protect, that the first principle is state sovereignty, and that sovereignty implies a responsibility to protect people. That's a shift.
Hobbes and Locke kind of stuff.
Exactly. It's a shift from kind of Westphalian thinking, as it's said, or simple UN Charter thinking, that sovereignty is all about rights to be free from intervention and outside interference. Now they're kind of thinking that that sovereignty implies certain responsibilities as well as rights. The second principle of R2P is that if a state is manifestly failing in its obligation, the second principle is the international community has a responsibility to aid states in their efforts to protect people. So state building and nation building and the assistance of development and those kinds of things that will help states engage with the problem of human protection is the second principle. So an international responsibility to aid states in their own protection. And then thirdly, and the real critical one for a lot of people, is that when states manifestly fail to protect their populations, either incapable or unwilling to protect their populations from mass atrocity crimes, the international community has a responsibility to intervene and to act on behalf of those threatened populations. And I should mention that, and this is only in 4 cases, the original R2P report from the ICAS Commission kind of envisioned a long series of possible intervention scenarios. But at the World Summit, they narrowed it down to just 4 crimes: ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So we call those crimes associated with the responsibility to protect.
I know John wants to jump in, but if I could ask just one other quick follow-up on that. Was there, nations intervening in other nations has been going on ever since they were nations.
Indeed.
But what recent event can you point to that really was the impetus for the United Nations finally to say, okay, we've got to put something in there? Was it Sarajevo? Was it Kosovo? Was it
That's
Srebrenica?
I think 2 things. I could speak to a long series of crises and cases from the 90s.
Said this is it. Yeah.
But I think the Rwandan failure really sparked a new conversation about sovereignty and intervention. And former Secretary General Kofi Annan kind of famously said that if, to the effect that if an intervention to stop genocide is an unacceptable sovereignty violation, then what are we going to do about Rwanda the next time it happens? Right? And he said that at the end of the 90s. Now, then the intervention in Kosovo was really critical for this conversation, because under the UN Charter and international law, there are 2 circumstances in which the use of force is acceptable. One is in self-defense. States have a right to defend themselves with use of force. And the UN Security Council authorization of use of force for the purpose of reestablishing or establishing or preventing lapses in international peace and security. Well, the Security Council deadlocked, as it often did during the Cold War. But this was Kosovo. This was Russia had a very particular connection to Serbia, and so the Security Council deadlocked. And as the ethnic cleansing was unfolding, there's an international clamoring for an intervention, certainly in the West, and NATO took it on its own with U.S. leadership to intervene into Kosovo without UN Security Council authorization, which officially makes it unlawful. Right? So a later commission found that the Kosovo intervention was unlawful yet legitimate, which is a really curious finding for a bunch of jurists. And those 2 things, I think, because it sidelined the United Nations process and the Security Council in particular, threatened the integrity and the efficacy of those institutions. Those 2 things, Rwandan failure, and then at the end, the Kosovo intervention, the unlawful intervention in Kosovo that many thought was, again, unlawful but legitimate, led to this convening of the ICAS Commission and the movement towards this new thinking.
Yeah, John?
So what's the role of the United Nations? Was R2P supposed to bring it back in so that it would be no longer legitimate to do a NATO-led intervention in a place like Kosovo? So R2P in that sense is saying there's a responsibility of the United Nations to step in and protect. Or was it to be able to set a more lawful groundwork for further instances of Kosovo, where it's the responsibility of the international community or some subset of the international community. Which of those is R2P supposed to do?
Yeah. Well, it sort of depends on which R2P we're talking about. Let me just kind of clarify what I mean by that. There's the R2P of the original ICUS Commission vision. Right? And in their view, right, they greatly preferred UN Security Council authorization for an intervention into a site of mass atrocity. Mass human suffering, I should say, because they envisioned some natural catastrophes could lead to an intervention, and that really came up in the cyclone Nargis in Burma in 2008. So their preference was for UN Security Council authorization to make it lawful, and they argued for the members, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council to kind of disavow the use of the veto in circumstances of mass atrocity and mass human suffering. But if the UN Security Council failed to act, the original vision of ICUS allowed unilateral or regional organizations to intervene. So there was that vision. Now, in 2005, at the World Summit, they narrow this concept in some very important ways, and in particular, they take away that possibility of a non-UN authorized intervention. It really, that's why I said earlier that this is about state sovereignty. It really does kind of reinforce state sovereignty, that the responsibility lies first with the state, and then the international community's responsibility is to aid states in their own protection. And then only thirdly, with UN authorization, right, does the international community have a responsibility to intervene in sites of mass human suffering, mass atrocity. So that's the international legal conception of R2P. Right? Some proponents of a broader understanding of R2P so kind of harken back to the 2000 vision. So it sort of depends on where you are on there. Some are unsatisfied with the World Summit version.
And 2005 is an important year. I mean, it's 2 years after the invasion of Iraq, yes. And Iraq then becomes kind of the critical case for R2P. Yeah. Could the Bush administration say they were exercising or fulfilling their obligation, their responsibility to protect against Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, they did in fact just do that. And Prime Minister Blair was even clearer in connecting the Iraq War to the responsibility to protect, much to the chagrin of proponents of the responsibility to protect, because it's clear that humanitarian concerns were merely ex post facto justifications for the war in Iraq. They had the 3 clear casus belli that they stipulated were the explanations for the war, the weapons of mass destruction, connections to 9/11, and Al-Qaeda links. Only once those 3 failed to surface, or once they failed to find any support for those, did they turn to humanitarian and a responsibility to protect kind.
I have to take a pause here, Brett, and remind our viewers that this is Consider This. We're broadcasting from the studios at IUPUI here in Indianapolis at Kavanaugh Hall. We're talking with Dr. John Clark, who is an international politician, or a professor of international politics, also the head of a think tank called Provocate here in Indianapolis. And also our special guest is Dr. Brett O'Bannon, who is an associate professor of political science at DePaul University, and also the author of a book which will be published at some point rather quickly, The Evolution of the Responsibility to Protect, Imperfect Duties. Can you tell us a little bit about that book before we launch into it more?
Sure. And the imperfect duties kind of relates to one dimension of humanitarian intervention problematique, and that's the ethical dimension. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of ethics question here, and the imperfect duties is a thinking about whose problem is it, whose responsibility is it, if we say that all people have a responsibility to act in a crisis situation. Onto whom precisely does that responsibility fall, if it's on everyone's shoulders? Right? There's a kind of, might say, a collective action problem involved. So, but the idea, the book comes out of a symposium that we held at the Prindle Institute of Ethics at DePaul University in 2009. We brought leading voices in the area of humanitarian intervention, critics, supporters. We brought practitioners of civil society actors and practitioners to come together to kind of hash out some of these ethical debates, but also the political and legal debates as well. So that book comes out of that effort.
One of the questions I had wanted to ask you, Brett, was simply why sometimes for the non-academic, the non-politician, observer, Joe Sixpack, watching on television. Why does it seem to take so long for governments to act on this responsibility to protect? When you look at, name any case that you've been talking about, how long it takes and how many thousands or hundreds or thousands of lives are lost and property destroyed and families decimated and that sort of thing before the nation state that decides to intervene finally either one goes to the United Nations, or if the United Nations balks for some reason, intervenes anyway. What is it? Politics? Is it? You talked about ethics and stuff, but is it political in nature or just logistical?
I think it's all those things. I just think it's all those things, right? On the ethical level, Peter Singer asked years ago if we have a responsibility to save strangers. You know, some argue that the answer to that question is no, that we have no obligation. We have obligations to our immediate family and to those in our circle, in our sort of tight circle of empathy, and we do not have an obligation to save strangers that are suffering. So there is at some level, certain resistance to sending, particularly soldiers, into dangerous situations to save strangers. Samuel Huntington, late political scientist, once argued that it was ethically untenable and politically, or ethically unsubstantiated or insupportable and politically untenable to send American soldiers to fight and die to keep Somalis from killing each other. That's sort of, and he wasn't alone in holding that position. Right? So there's that kind of opposition to things, both an ethical and a kind of political problem. There is the political problem of expending treasure and blood for these kinds of dangerous missions that may turn out to be much more complicated, as Somalia did, right, as we discovered in Somalia, than anticipated and banked on. Right? There are some legal obligations that need to be kind of adhered to. The use of force, as I was saying, is only authorized in 2 circumstances. So it's hard to generate that Security Council support for an intervention when each of the 5 permanent members has its own domestic constituencies to consider and to perhaps kowtow to, if that's the case. So there are the sad reality, and I should also add that a number of there are human rights activists who fear military humanitarian intervention. Right? There are real concerns that the use of the military for humanitarian purposes is just contradictory. Right? That Kosovo intervention gave us the term humanitarian bombing, and I'll give you a kind of sense of what their critique is. The Clinton administration was really quite concerned about the loss of American lives in the Kosovo intervention. So one of the things that the Clinton administration did was require NATO planes to fly first at 15,000 feet when they bombed, right, and then dropped it to 10,000 feet. That's still quite a high altitude to try to discern enemy from friendly. Right? Flying at that level in order to, and that's a total political thing, right? That's about domestic public consumption and all that kind of stuff. But what that meant was that collateral damage was made much, much more likely. And critics of the Kosovo intervention said that we caused as much damage as we saw as we rescued people as we rescued. So there are a lot of reasons why it's hard to generate an intervention, and some say that's a good thing.
But if there's a universal law, not a law, but a concept as evidenced in the United Nations, you may disagree with it fundamentally, but if most nations sign on to that, it would seem to me that one would have an obligation to do so, whether there was public support for it or not.
And that's the very idea of the responsibility to protect. That, and I should point out, you're absolutely right, that it wasn't just most nations. It was unanimous at the World Summit. All 192 or 94 signatories signed on to the World Summit outcome document that stipulated the principles of the responsibility to protect.
Sudan signed on. Sudan, Sudan signing on is basically to say, invade us, and yet they still felt as though they had to do that.
Yeah.
Well, you're missing maybe one of the important things that makes it difficult to make that intervention, and that's that the president has a responsibility to protect the national interest. And if there's a conflict between what he sees as the national interest and a kind of moral responsibility, there's not one trump or the other Trump. It's just a conflict. It's a tragic situation. Samantha Powers, who is she and why was she in the news lately?
Well, yes, she's really a critical voice in all of this, and it started with a book that she wrote in the 90s, A Problem from Hell, that dealt with genocides in various places. Rwanda was the kind of critical chapter for a lot of people in that book. That made a name for herself. She won a Pulitzer Prize with her first book, actually. She's now head of the Atrocity Prevention Board in the administration, and has subsequently and more recently been nominated to serve as ambassador to the United Nations. Quite a remarkable trajectory for someone.
It was, but when she went before the Senate committee to be confirmed as UN ambassador, the first question they asked was about humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect. What does she think about that? And her answer was maybe triply, quadruply hedged by saying, well, if there is an atrocity and if we do have evidence of it, we really ought to start thinking about, what we might be able to do in the future. I mean, she was not able to say, that's the Trump. We need to protect, and so I think that it illustrates how tough that is for someone in the administration who has that responsibility. There's not an easy answer.
Yeah, you're so right that's not the same voice that authored A Problem from Hell.
Right.
It's the author of A Problem from Hell was very certain, writing with absolute certitude about the ethical, political, moral dimensions of all of this, and having served the administration now since the beginning, she's got different views now. I think. Yeah.
Well,
or maybe
she wasn't running for confirmation when she wrote the book, which is much easier and less pressure,
Indeed.
I suppose.
Yeah.
When we choose to intervene in something, does intervention have to be military? Does it have to be physical in the sense that America does it? Or, to a case in point, in our next iteration of the show, we're going to talk about specific examples of humanitarian intervention, such as Syria and Libya and what have you. But there is talk about the United States, countering Russian aid to the Syrian government and providing military support of some kind. This is not boots on the ground at this point. Not boots on the ground, but it does represent, helping arm one side. Now, there are a lot of questions that come up when we think about doing that, because obviously that we then take sides, and are we an honest broker and blah blah. But is that also considered humanitarian intervention when we provide military support but not boots on the ground?
Yeah, that's really critical to the responsibility to protect discourse. The proponents of R2P are really clear, and the current Secretary General is an avid supporter and a great proponent and entrepreneur for the norm. And the World Summit narrowed the range of scenarios into which we'd intervene. But the Secretary General has said it's a narrow concept, but we want it to be a deep concept, meaning that the toolbox is broad, is big. There are lots of ways we can intervene, short of a direct military intervention, reaction to an existing crisis. And what they mean by that is, and this takes it even farther, I think, than what you may have been thinking, prevention is supposed to be the original ICUS document said that prevention is the most important dimension of the responsibility to protect. So, that runs from kind of deep structural development concerns that help states increase their capacity to protect populations, to kind of more immediate crisis mediation. So there are lots of ways proponents of the R2P say we can intervene that have nothing to do with militarized humanitarian intervention, sending troops into the ground. You're specifically asking, however, are there steps just short of military intervention that are clearly elements of force? And I think that's also true, right? That proponents of the use of force, proponents of the R2P see sanctioning, right? Targeted sanctions against regime members. That's clearly coercion and use of force. Very comfortable and really support that there are many options available, many tools in the toolbox, short of sending planes over, boots on the ground.
Yeah. One of the interesting conundrums, I suppose, about all of this, and we only have about 2.5 minutes of active conversation left, Brett, I'll remind you both, is the question of whether or not we, in order to save lives, to to protect or to intervene, we have to spend lives to do that. And what an awful dilemma that is for any nation, whether it's us or whether it's Russia or anybody else thinking about intervening in a project or in a crisis. If we are going to spend hundreds of lives to save thousands or even different, who cares about the numbers? I mean, but it's just the idea. Right. It must be an awful conundrum.
That's exactly the dilemma. I mean, we talked about humanitarian intervention dilemma, and it speaks directly to this, right? And as well as the collateral damage that you are guaranteed to cause when you insert military forces into a situation like Kosovo or today in Syria to save lives. The mere nature of contemporary weaponry means that collateral damage, innocents will die.
Yeah. But then to top it all off, the sheer uncertainty. Who would have imagined that 800,000 people would die in Rwanda? Literally no one. No one could have imagined that. And it now makes perfect sense to intervene knowing that 800,000 people were to die. But when you don't know that before, that makes it tough. Libya, there's a tough one. If we wouldn't have intervened in Libya, I'm convinced that fewer people would die than actually died. When we intervened, we created a 6-month civil war. The brutality would have been short and appalling. Gaddafi would still be in power, but you don't know that. You just don't know that, and how do you make that decision?
Yeah, dilemma is exactly the right word for this stuff.
It's interesting because, excuse me, the world at large was kind of in this same kind of dilemma, not really understanding or knowing the extent of atrocities against the Jews in World War II. It's heartbreaking sometimes when you don't know the answer, so you can't do something until after it's done, and then you think back. In any case, Brett, thank you very much for being with us on this version 1 of Consider This. John Clark, our guest, who is an often contributor here at IUPUI. He's the head of Provocate, a think tank here in Indianapolis, and Brett is Associate Professor of Political Science at DePaul University and the author of an upcoming book called The Evolution of Responsibility to Protect Imperfect Duties. Thank you both very much for being with us, and we invite you to stick around for another couple of weeks until we have the second part of this discussion on humanitarian intervention. In any case, from all of us here on the staff of Consider This, thank you for joining us. I'm Sam Graves. Good day.